So I'm going to introduce our presenter. Our presenter is Dr. Janine Morris. She is an assistant professor of writing at Nova Southeastern University. She works in the School of Communication, Media, and the Arts in the College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences. Her research interests include digital and multimodal writing, reading and literacy studies, online writing instructions, and affect and emotion in writing centers. She's presented at regional and national conferences, and her scholarship has appeared in journals such as College English Association Critic, Pedagogy, Computers and Composition, Composition Studies, College English, and Communication Literacy Journal. With that said, I'd like to introduce you to our presenter, Dr. Janine Morris.
Hello, everyone. Can everybody hear me okay? Awesome. Okay. Can everybody see my screen? Yes, you can see the presentation. Do you see the presentation full screen? Okay, great. I'm working in a room with two computer screens, and it's not always clear how the screens are going to show up for others. So I'm glad you can see it. I'm very excited to be here with you today. Fake news is a topic that I am incredibly passionate about. And you know, a lot of my work is with undergraduate students, and their own perceptions of media literacy is something that comes up often. And then, you know, as a writing professor, I'm very interested in things like source use and the trouble that I see my students having with things like fake news. So I really I'm excited to be able to talk about this with all of you. And then, you know, just as a social media user and a media consumer, you know, this is a topic that I think is very important. So today we're going to be covering what fake news is, where it comes from, why it's a problem, how you can spot fake news when you see it, and then we'll talk a bit about techniques for source checking information and engaging in dialogue with others. So hopefully you'll walk away from the presentation with some skills that you can use next time you encounter fake news. So what you see here is an image of Google Trends searches for fake news since before 2016. So there's been an increase in searching for fake news since 2016. And a lot of these searches are wrapped up in uncertainty, confusion, and then you see often the political side of fake news where politicians are making accusations and claiming reports of fake news. Right, so you see that the spikes in fake news first start after July 2016, and then where you see the massive spike in February 2018 is because in January 2018, President Trump had his fake news awards. So that was that spike at that time. But you know, since then, we've seen it decrease quite a bit in terms of searches that people do over Google. But even if it's not as highly of a search term, it's still something that's quite important. So I wanted to start today with a poll for all of you, just to see how you, what your perceptions are. So the poll I just put into the poll area, and I want you to choose, you know, one of the three options. So completely made up news has caused a great deal of confusion, some confusion, or not much or no confusion at all. So I'm interested in seeing what people in the room see about that. So if you're able to answer the poll, that would be awesome. All right, so a great deal of confusion. And you know what, that is quite a common response. So this is a question that was asked by Pew researchers at the Pew Research Center, who said that 64% of Americans feel that fake news causes them a great deal of confusion, and 24% report feeling at least some confusion around the topic of fake news. And these views are shared across income levels, education, party affiliation, and other demographic characteristics. So at this time in 2016, you know, over 88% of people polled said that they have at least some confusion about fake news. And so that's why I think, you know, it's really important that we have these conversations about what fake news is. However, the fake news that we are talking about and thinking of isn't a current event. So even though we see people talking about fake news in certain ways today, before fake news became part of our lexicon, propaganda has a history, a long history of use for political gain. So we see that Octavian, who later was Augustus, would depict flattering and youthful images of himself throughout the Roman Empire. Mark Antony also used propaganda during their civil war. And so Octavian read Antony's, quote, official will to the Senate in Rome, which turned Romans against Antony. And because of this propaganda against him, Antony was seen as a traitor and people were turned against him. Oh, okay, you can't see my screen. Okay, let me try this again. How about now? Can you see my screen now? No. Is there a way that I could see what you see? Oh, no one can see your screen. Sorry, everybody, just 1 second. Okay, better? Okay, awesome. I'm very sorry about that. So we're back with Mark Antony, and even the word propaganda has quite a long history. So the first time propaganda becomes part of the official lexicon is in the 17th century. And so you first hear about the Congregation of the Propaganda Committee of Cardinals responsible for foreign missions, founded in 1622 by Pope Gregory XV. So that word propaganda comes up as a group of a religious group in the 1600s. And it's not really until the 1800s that we come to our current understanding of propaganda as a systematic dissemination of information, especially in a biased or misleading way. So you see things like Marx and Engels' Communist Manifesto, or P.K. O'Cleary's History of the Italian Revolution. And then I think most often people associate propaganda with war propaganda during the 20th century. So you have Mussolini running production companies, British and Italian propaganda during World War I, which is what you see on the screen. But instead of propaganda, which is certainly a form of fake news, and we see propaganda defined as the spreading of ideas, information or rumors for the purposes of helping or injuring a cause, institution, or person. And then ideas, facts, allegations spread deliberately to further one's cause or to damage an opposing cause. So propaganda, we can think of propaganda as more top down. So propaganda is something that's put out that affects people who are in power, who are more the institution. Whereas when I am talking about fake news, and propaganda is certainly a form of fake news, what we're seeing today is the kind of news that's produced by citizens. So rather something that's government than something that's government controlled, fake news, especially with the internet, is existing on a person by person basis. So people are creating that information themselves. But even this kind of fake news is not new. So in 1835, the New York Sun, which was a New York-based newspaper, published a series of 6 articles about life on the moon. And so supposedly the writer is taking information from the Edinburgh Journal of Science and is quoting an astronomer named Sir John Herschel, who apparently had a telescope that was powerful enough to observe fantastic animals, unicorns, winged creatures, lush landscapes, amethyst crystals, and massive craters. And so in 1835, the Sun is reporting about these supposed discoveries that Herschel made. So following this story, sales of the Sun went up. Yale researchers came to New York to follow the study. And Herschel, who was researching in Africa at the time, would receive mail with questions about his discoveries. So throughout the course of the 6 articles, nobody realized that this was fake. By 1835, the Edinburgh Journal of Science, so the supposed source where the information came from, was actually out of print. There was no such author. And by September that year, so the story first came out in June, and then by September, people realized that the editors admitted that this was a hoax. And so this is just one of many really fascinating historical examples of fake news happening in the 19th century. And you see with the advent of different mediums like radio and television, there's a lot more examples of hoaxes that are really quite amazing that have happened in the past 100 years. So when I am talking about fake news today, I like using Hunt Alcott and Matthew Jensko's definition. And Alcott is from Stanford, Jensko's from NYU, and they define fake news as news articles that are intentionally and verifiably false and could mislead readers. So there are a couple things that comprise this view of fake news. So one is that these are intentionally fabricated news stories. So these are stories that are made to look like real news stories. So we see here examples of the Baltimore Gazette and Denver Guardian. So these are made to look like locally affiliated websites, but they include fake clickbaity content. So the actual Baltimore Gazette was around in 1865 to 1875. So Baltimore Gazette you see today, not true. And then the Denver Guardian the Denver Post, so the actual Denver newspaper, ended up discrediting the Denver Guardian. So, you see that the Baltimore Gazette and the Denver Guardian are made to look similar to newspaper sources, but really they are inaccurate. And then we see a lot today with the kinds of less obvious fake news stuff that you may see on friends' social media posts. So you see, people share stories, maybe without reading, without looking into what's happening. And I'll talk more about this later, but now Facebook will actually do a bit of fact checking there for you. So this post was shared and the AP News and FactCheck.org checked into the accuracy of that source. So those are more the fake news things that I'm talking about. What I'm not talking about would be, oh, sorry. So along with what I am talking about would include sites that are satirical if you don't realize that they're satire. So if you, it's clear something's satirical, that's not considered, I wouldn't consider that fake news. I think that's satire. But, people often can mistake, if they're not familiar with certain sites, can mistake what the news is saying. So what I'm not going to be talking about today would be things like unintentional reporting mistakes. So if people accidentally report false information, rumors that do not originate from a news article. So these would be rumors that are spread by different people, conspiracy theories, obvious satire, statements by politicians that are false, or true but biased articles. So these all have a place within the bigger landscape of fake news, but really what I'm focusing on with you in the next little bit would be the kinds of fake news that is purposefully false reporting. So before I get into addressing how we deal with fake news, I want to talk a little bit about why fake news is a problem. So the problem with today's fake news is, first of all, that it's incredibly easy and profitable. So Cameron Harris out of Columbus, Ohio, created a now defunct domain called Christian Times, and this is back in 2016. So he bought the domain name for $5. In 15 minutes, he wrote a story, found a stock image, about tens of thousands of fraudulent Clinton votes found in an Ohio warehouse. So 15 minutes, $5, he creates this story. The story was spread across different Facebook pages, fake Facebook pages. This story made him $5,000. So he's quoted as saying, even before I posted it, I knew it would take off. And so I've read quite a few features and interviews with different fake news writers who all talk about the incredible profit they can make from sharing this information. So people can make anywhere from 5 cents a click to around $6,000 a month for writing and sharing fake news. And on the higher end of things, people have made between $10,000 and $30,000 a month. And so these are individuals within the US creating this. This is not coming out of kind of the fake news factories that were happening in Eastern Europe. So it was very, very easy and lucrative to create this stuff. The second problem is the rise in social media use and the ability to disseminate fake news. So in 2016, there were 1.8 billion active Facebook users per month and 400 million Twitter users. And in 2018, Pew did a study of how many adults get their news off of social media. And so in 2018, 68% of adults polled use social media for their news at least occasionally. And so of this number, 43% use Facebook, 12% use Twitter, 5% use Reddit, 21% use YouTube, which I think is really fascinating that 21% of people who are getting their news from social media get it from YouTube. So a lot of people, are consuming their news through social media, and these numbers vary depending on the demographics. So the older a demographic gets, the less likely they are to use social media as their Facebook source. But between 18 and 29-year-olds, about 30% or 40% primarily use social media to get their news. And so what's problematic about these numbers are that a lot of the news that's generated on social networking and a lot of the information we see is created for us through algorithms. So I'm sure that many people have had the experience of, Googling something and then later seeing an ad for that product, or talking about something and then seeing an ad for it. And so a lot of what we see on social media has been aggregated for us, and we really don't see the full landscape. So if I only see a fraction of what's available, even within my own friend list, and that information is reduced and then organized based on what kind of searches I do, then that's really problematic. And so a lot of the issue with social media is that it sort of creates an echo chamber where the views that we have get confirmed and reinforced on these platforms. The third reason why fake news is a growing concern is because of our tendency to distrust mainstream news sources. And so Alcott and Jensko, in their research, analyzed the trust in mainstream media. So between 1998 and 2014, you see an overall drop in the great deal or fair amount of trust in mainstream news, right? So 1998, across almost all different political affiliations, there's a drop. And you see the biggest drop in Republicans most sharply after 2014. So there's generally a lack of distrust of mainstream media, which is what pushes people to seek other sources. But those sources can also lead to confirmation bias, right? So people distrust mainstream news, therefore they seek out people who they trust and then people who will confirm our beliefs. So neuroscientist Daniel Levitin says a big part of the problem here is that the human brain often makes up its mind based on emotional considerations, and then we seek to justify them. So we think and judge with emotions. We trust people we know without really questioning their information and their intentions. So it's problematic that we distrust mainstream news because then we end up going to people who maybe already are thinking like us. And again, we're not getting the full scope of information that's being presented. And then finally, another reason for the reason that fake news is problematic would be because of political polarization. So Sean Westwood, who's an assistant professor at Dartmouth University, says that partisanship for a long period of time wasn't viewed as part of who we are. It wasn't core to our identity. It was just an ancillary trait. But in the modern era, we view party identity as something akin to gender, ethnicity, or race, the core traits we use to describe ourselves to others. So like confirmation bias, we seek stories that support our views of our parties. And so sharing stories on social media then becomes a way to show our support for our partisan team. So he says it's like painting a face on a game day, that we show our affiliation by promoting content that supports our party. But there's a lot of divide about how people of different parties access their news and what kind of news they get. So consistent conservatives usually cluster around a single source. So in this Pew study, they found that 47% of conservatives go to Fox News for their government and politics. Liberals, they found, were less unified in their media. So they would look on a number of different outlets like NPR, the New York Times. And so because people sort of leaning more towards the left would seek out more sources, that's why you see more across that distribution. But I mean, we look for information that confirms what we believe and what we know about the world. So, you know, it's important to think about, you know, where we're getting information and how people kind of share and repeat information that they access. So I have another poll for you to think of to answer. And so this one is asking who has the greatest responsibility for greatest responsibility to stop fake news from gaining attention. So is it members of the public, the government, social networking sites, all three, or none of the above? So if you could take a second and answer that poll, that would be awesome. So who has the greatest responsibility here? Is it us as members of the public? Is it the government or our elected officials? Is it all three? Or is it none of these people? Okay, so let me close this poll. Okay, so 67% of you said, I'm not going to share the response just so we don't get into the situation from before, but 67% said all three are responsible, and 33% said members of the public. And so I think that you are all correct that, we as consumers have a lot of responsibility, and then the responsibility can go to others as well. So similar to the Pew study, we see that the distribution of responsibility falls on different people. So 43% of people said that it's the public's responsibility, 45% said it was the government's responsibility, and 42% said it is up to social networks. And in the time since this poll came out in 2016, you do see attempts to rectify fake news. Okay, on coming from all fronts. So let me post. Sorry, you can't see the screen. Better? Awesome. Okay, so you can see here in this Pew poll that the distribution of responsibility is going across all three different groups. But I think what's interesting is this quote from Justin Kohler, who created the Denver Guardian, which we saw a little while ago. He said, some of this has to fall on the readers themselves. The consumers of content have to be better at identifying this stuff. We have a whole nation of media illiterate people. Really, there needs to be something done. And so this is the man who started creating fake news stories initially to reveal people's gullibility. However, he is one of the people who would make between $10,000 and $30,000 a month off of fake news. So even though he is saying that we should be responsible, this is somebody who's greatly profited off of the distribution of his fake news, which I think is a very interesting comment for him to make. And now we do see different attempts to kind of modify this. So you see Google and Facebook kind of flagging or removing fake news. You see blocking ads. You see, like in the example I showed you where Facebook had its little fact checker function. But really, I mean, we are the ones who have to be responsible. But how good of judges are we really? So I have one last poll for you to do. I'm going to try to get it right this time. I want to know, how confident are you in detecting your own ability to judge made-up news? So are you very confident? Are you somewhat confident? Are you not very confident, or not confident at all? So if you could take just a second to do that. Okay, so right now I have 50% or 67% are somewhat confident, and 33% are not confident about their ability. Okay, can everybody see my screen before I keep going? Awesome. Okay. So most people say that they are either somewhat confident or very confident. So like many of you, you've indicated somewhat confident. So 45% of people said somewhat confident. And for this Pew poll, 39% said they felt very confident. But you have to sort of wonder how true that information is based on the amount of fake news that gets spread. And so that's why I think it's really important to be able to start reading like a fact checker and fact check the news. And so I'm going to talk about 5 best practices according to Alexios Mantzarlis, who's the director of International Fact-Checking Network at Poynter, and Melissa Zimners, who is a communications assistant professor at Merrimack College. And so Mantzarlis says that when fact-checking the news, you go through a series of steps. You isolate a claim, you find the best primary sources, you match or refute the claim or prove it, and then when you're presented with all the limitations of the data, you then make a decision about the claim that's being made. So of these 5 best practices, the first one is to double check the URL and the domain name. And so domains like .com or .edu have different restrictions, and they can help us learn about a source's credibility. So something that's .gov is government, .com is commercial. Something that is .net has no restrictions. Anything that's .co, you should be a little suspicious of. So here we have, abc.com, which is a legitimate news site, versus abc.com.co, which is made to appear to be legitimate, but it's not. And then you see different blogging or social media platforms, so like .wordpress.com or .blogger.com. Those would all be, all of those kind of URLs give you information about a source. So when you are looking at where an article, let's say, comes from, you want to make sure that it's from, a legitimate like .com source, or that if it's abcnews.com, that you don't see something like abcnews.com.co. The second best practice would be to read the About section. So on a legitimate site, the About section should use straightforward language and information about the site's creators. So you should be wary of sites that have disclaimers. So like sometimes a satirical website will say on the About page that the site is satirical. And if there's a lack of an About page, you should also be suspicious of that. So on the example here, you can see from the New York Times, there's a whole series of different About pages that you can look into and that you could see what's there. So, and on the right, the About section you see there is from abc.com. So unlike these, well-detailed About sections, the abc.co.com had a 2-sentence footer on their website that I could not repeat here because it would use sensational language like the devil's playground and die in a fire. And those were words that appeared on the About page of that site. So you could tell if you took a minute to look at it that there was something really suspicious about that site, that maybe you'd want to avoid it. So number 3 and 4, we'll look at them together. So pay attention to quotes in a story or a lack of quotes, and reverse search the images. So accurate stories will rely on multiple sources. They'll link you to original studies or articles. They'll give you information about the authors and their expertise. And remember, something like expertise is quite narrow and specialized. Right, so like a family doctor has a certain kind of medical specialty, but that's quite different from like a pathologist or an oncologist, right? So both are doctors, all 3 are doctors, but what an oncologist studies is quite different from what a pathologist studies, from what a family doctor studies. So expertise is quite specialized. So in one example, the World Daily News put out an article about a morgue employee who was cremated by mistake while he was taking a nap. Okay, so in this article, you see 2 quotes, or you see 2 images. You see a coworker quote. So the coworker says, "At first we didn't understand where the sound was coming from. When we realized what was happening, it was too late. We shut down the heating system, but he was already dead." And so this is apparently from the morgue coworker who said this. But besides the images and the quote, there's no live links or other photos. And so if you take the time to reverse image search the images, the picture of the deceased was actually a picture of a DeSoto County constable who was arrested in 2015, so not a deceased morgue employee. And the picture of the coworker is of a forensic pathologist from a 2012 article. Right, so just taking that extra step to look at those images can give you so much more information that you wouldn't be able to see if you just took the article at face value. So it's very important as readers that you verify where images are coming from. And so if it's questionable, search on a site like Snopes or PolitiFact, where those people will have already kind of fact-checked that source for you. And it's really easy to reverse search an image. You just right-click on the image, search Google, and then see where that picture appears. Like, does it appear on different websites? And then finally, the last practice would be to fact-check the content. Look for things like sensationalism, the fact that the title matches the content. A lot of people just share information without actually reading it. And make sure that there aren't, any really serious grammar or spelling mistakes. So a lot, reputable sources should be well written. And so, for example, in July 2016, a story was circulating on social media that said a giant asteroid could hit Earth next week. People would post things like, "This is so disturbing, I'm so worried about this." And reading that headline, you would think like, yes, this is very concerning. But if you actually clicked on the link and read the article, you would be confronted with this quote: "Nah, I'm totally messing with you. There's no asteroid, at least not about to strike Earth next week. But there is a new study by computer scientists at Columbia University and French National Institute that has found that 59% of links shared on social media have never actually been clicked, meaning that most people who share news on social media aren't actually reading it first." And so this article was meant to be sort of clickbaity, but really shows how quickly you can share something without having read it and why that's problematic. So if you're seeing information and want to share it on social media, you should take the time to read it before you do that. And there are many great resources that you can use to help with the fact checking. So Snopes is a bipartisan website, fact-checking website that was founded in 1994. And these sources are all part of the International Fact-Checking Network, and they have certain standards for fact-checking that they maintain, where they're bipartisan, transparent with their sources, and are really upfront about their methods of funding. So Snopes is just sort of any kind of random news article. You can search it there or send it to them and they will fact check it. PolitiFact is where you could go to fact check claims made by politicians. And then FactCheck.org is another nonpartisan group that looks at accuracy of what politicians are saying. So beyond these resources, another resource which is not continuing, it's not updated anymore, but Melissa Zimdars wrote or created this massive bibliography of misleading, clickbaity, and satirical news sites. And so she said that the reason why she stopped keeping this site up was because many of these sources will go away very quickly. They'll be up for a little bit of time and then they'll move on. And so she's not keeping it up, but it's just quite impressive if you ever want to look and see where how extensive the sources are. And then the News Literacy Project has a series of 10 questions for fake news detection. And so this PDF would be a really useful guide to follow to try to figure out like whether or not different news is accurate or not. And these are things that you can do on your own. And then there's also some like really great books that give you helpful information. So Daniel Levitin's Weaponized Wise allows you to think about how numbers are used and how to think critically within a climate where fake news is so prominent. So it's really, there's a lot of great stuff just out there that can be helpful as well. And finally, I just want to say that it's really important to talk with others. Research shows that people want to hear views that align with their own thinking. So the Harvard Business Review in May of 2016 reviewed 1,866 voters and found that 81% of them avoided political discussions at all costs. So avoiding conversations is not a great approach, and it doesn't really accomplish anything. So you don't want to shout at nothing. So these are a couple tips for some real conversations. So first of all, focus on learning. Conversations are opportunities to learn. So you know that it's very difficult to change someone's mind. But if you know you're going to go into a conversation, go in with an open mind. Be curious. Ask why people feel the way that they do. So cultivating a greater sense of openness and understanding can allow for more conversations to happen. Before you get into a heated conversation, make sure it's okay. So ask if it's okay to have the conversation and to share your views. Show and communicate respect. And so that's not just in your words, but that's in your body language as well. So don't interrupt, don't roll your eyes, don't cross your arms. Your body communicates a certain message. And then, as well, don't do things like calling people names, interrupting, talking over them, or discounting their ideas. Find common grounds. So even if you disagree on something, look for something that you can agree on. And then finally, know your facts. So don't take on a heated argument if you aren't sure what you're talking about. It's okay to say, this is something I'm going to have to research and I will get back to you, right? You can put conversations off. And so once you've done the research, you can go back and continue a conversation at a different point in time. You don't have to engage. And it's really important to call out fake news. So if you see that something is incorrect or inaccurate, it's the responsible thing to do before it spreads or shares is just to call it out. And so I'm going to end with a quote from Obama's farewell address that American democracy is weakened when we allow our political dialogue to become so corrosive that people of good character are turned off from public service, so coarse with rancor that Americans with whom we disagree are not just misguided, but somehow malevolent. And so it's hard to have these conversations, but it's everybody's responsibility. And so I just want to end with this quote to highlight the importance of talking with one another. So hopefully I've given you some things to think about today. I know we covered a lot in a pretty short period of time, but I would love to hear from all of you, answer questions you have, and continue the discussion. So thank you for letting me be here.
Well, thank you, Dr. Morris. Very stimulating conversation. Would you mind telling me your interest in this field? Why are you interested in this field?
So a lot of the work that I do is with first-year students, so first-year composition students. And one of the goals of our classes with them is to help them become more critical readers. And as somebody who studies reading, my dissertation was on digital reading, I really care a lot about how people are judging sources. So I think especially as students are entering the university setting, helping them figure out how to read not just scholarly sources, but popular sources and distinguish between them will really help stop the spread of misinformation, at least as new generations come out.
Now, you alluded to a large number of individuals getting their news from social media, in particular YouTube. Tell me why that is of concern.
So I think part of the reason why the news online is of concern is that other studies have shown that people have a hard time distinguishing advertisements from opinions, that people have a hard time knowing what's an editorial versus something that's supposed to be just a report of an incident. And so my concern with things like YouTube or, with my students today, we were talking about news they get on Snapchat, is that you may start on like a CNN video, let's say, but on Snapchat anyway, it'll scroll to the next video. And that could just be a user-generated video. So if people aren't in the practice of looking critically at what they're watching or consuming, then you may think that you're still watching a CNN produced video, but it's in fact, Janine Morris's video about her opinion.
And one of the phenomenons that I've always sort of noticed is when individuals repeat information without either clarifying or identifying the source.
Yeah.
I know that's very common. How do you recognize that, and how do you address that?
So I think that that's something that people themselves have to start doing, is to see when they're consuming something, take the time to actually go and look up where that information is coming from, and to know what kind of sources are reputable. I think Google News has a really good news aggregator that will give you perspectives from multiple newspapers on a certain topic, but that shows multiple perspectives. So I think that actively searching for information that maybe contradicts your own beliefs, looking across sources. So if you see something, I encourage my students to do is if they see something questionable, try to find someone else who's saying the same thing. Because if I find it on one source, but it's only that one source that's saying it, maybe I should be suspect about it. But if I see it in one place, and then let's say I see it in several other different news outlets that kind of come from a variety of perspectives, you may be more apt to trust that.
And talk about, again, you alluded to the fact that we tend to seek out news sources that we believe in or we share their values. Why do we do that as a species?
I think we want to be right. That we believe a lot, especially what I've been reading a lot about people's political affiliations, especially, is that because they're tied so much to our identities, that they're part of our core beings, and our belief system, especially belief systems that we've grown up with, are very much tied to our self-perceptions and our beliefs about the world in general. So it's very, very difficult to change the views that we have, especially as we age. And so I think if you have the mindset that you are right, that your beliefs are the only thing that's correct, and you aren't willing to see competing information or competing information as a chance to grow, then those, I think, are the biggest challenges to stopping fake news. I think that the more we can encourage people to recognize and acknowledge different perspectives and have conversations about things like politics instead of avoiding them, and being willing and receptive to learning from other people, I think that that will make it better. But I think that, a lot of times we want to confirm our beliefs, as self-protection mechanisms. We don't want our views challenged.
And why is it more difficult for someone, as you mentioned, older, to try to seek out other sources than, say, someone who's younger?
In looking at that specific data about where people are, what kind of platforms people are using to access their news, in this particular Pew study, you see that people who are over 65 tend to go to television for their news. And so I'm not sure if those are just sort of generational things, that generationally people who are now 18 to 29 have spent the last decade with social media. So that's where their information is coming from. Whereas, by people who are currently like in their 40s and 50s and 60s have grown up reading print newspapers and maybe watching news on television, and that's where they would go to access that information.
Uh-huh.
So I think it'll be, and with this study, it was fascinating to see that only 16% of people use print newspapers.
Uh-huh.
You know, so as I think our media platforms change, I think it'll be really fascinating to see where people access their news and their information going forward.
And this phenomenon of fake news or propaganda, is that only an American kind of issue, or is this a worldwide issue?
It's definitely a worldwide issue. So this at NSU, for undergrad students, we have an honors college. And so faculty here can propose classes based on topics that they're interested in. So this semester, I'm actually teaching a fake news class. It's an honors class. And one of the books that we read is called The Martians Have Landed. And this book covers media hoaxes for the last 100 years, or more than the last 100 years, like since the 1800s. But the examples brought up in the book focus on how new technologies bring new kinds of hoaxes. So when the radio came out, you see the War of the Worlds event in the 1930s, where people tune into the radio and they think they hear an alien invasion because they missed the disclaimer at the beginning of the show. And so, you know, I was sort of surprised to learn just how, you know, how people have all the time spread misinformation for different reasons, whether it's to boost newspaper sales or to boost radio ratings or to boost TV ratings, or to share a certain view of a candidate. You know, what we see here and what we're seeing now is definitely not new and definitely not limited to US or North America.
And again, for our participants, if you do have any questions, please let me know. Concerning the media companies or the tech companies, yes, as consumers, we must be the ones to determine whether or not the information is in fact correct. But from a policy-wise, what role do you think media companies or tech companies should play in discouraging fake news?
So this is another conversation that I've been having a lot with my students in this class. You know, and we talked about things like, okay, would it be better if every site had verified users? So you know that if you're seeing the CNN Instagram page that it's verified, therefore it's actually CNN. But, you know, the problem with that is then, you know, you see somebody like Chrissy Teigen, for example, who's very politically active online, who is a verified user of Twitter and Instagram, but is she the most authoritative source to go to for your political views? So just because someone's verified doesn't mean that what they're saying is correct. So I think that certainly media sites, like my example with Facebook from earlier, let me just go back to that slide, was I think really a step in the right direction. That if different sites are using all sorts of algorithms to get and share information, why not have something that's fact-checked? Right, so I think that that's something that people could do. I know that Google has stopped paying out ads to sites that have been proven to be fake, so I think that that can stop the monetization in some ways. But I do think that, you know, government has responsibility, people have responsibility, and then the sites themselves should not be spreading information or allowing fake, the creation of multiple fake sites. Because I think there was a problem for a while on Facebook where hundreds of false sites would be created to like bots, robots would create all these fake sites to share different fake sources and just keep kind of perpetuating them.
So I believe Trinice has a question. Would you mind typing your questions, Trinice? And while she's doing that, I know there are a few countries in the world that have actually created laws concerning fake news. and they've prosecuted individuals they believe are perpetuating fake news. What is your point of view on that?
I think that that's a complicated. Issue. So I know that in 2016, especially, a lot of fake news that we were seeing in the U.S. was coming out of Macedonia. That there would be fake news factories almost where people would just generate a ton of fake content. And so in instances like that, how do you deal with that in the US when the person isn't even in the US? So I don't really know if I have an answer about what I think is the best way to approach it, other than not sharing it, taking it down, and not spreading it and stopping other people from spreading it.
So Trinice has a question. Would you agree that social media has advantages and disadvantages in that it brings light certain situations, but it also overemphasizes these situations? For instance, it makes us believe that certain situations occur more than they actually do. So the use of social media to increase the perception or the frequency of occurrences.
Yes, so I think that's a great question. And I think it just sort of shows the complexities of our social media use. Because I think on the one hand, social media is incredibly advantageous. So you see, for instance, when the Boston bombing occurred, that people were able to use social media to on the ground tell you what was going on in that moment. And I think it brings to light different causes in certain ways. So, one of the things my students were reading about is that because of news media, the percentage chance of things happening, for example, a school shooting is not likely to happen at all. I think that, you're more likely to get struck by lightning than you are to be involved in a situation where there's a shooter in a school. And so I know that that gets a lot of media coverage, but I think that that's quite important so that people are still kind of aware that this is a problem and is something that needs to be dealt with. So I think that you're correct that you can kind of use social or different media can be used to overemphasize things, but it also can be very beneficial. So I don't know. I think that that's such a good question, that there are advantages, there are disadvantages, and it just depends how media is used. But it's really disadvantageous when false information is repeatedly shared and then that becomes our new narrative.
And going back to the tech companies and their social media companies, do you think they should be financially liable, for instance, if they knowingly perpetuate or spread fake news?
I think that that's a great question. I do think that they have responsibility. I don't know where the financial responsibility would go, but I think that they should be accountable for the information that's shared, or at least make it more difficult and harder to share that information. I think especially preventing the creation of multiple fake accounts or robot accounts. I think that those are things that the companies certainly have technology to avoid. But I mean, it's hard because all of these companies at the end of the day are making billions of dollars. So even though we would like to think that they purport to be there to spread conversation and bring people together, that we're not making billions of dollars by being Facebook users, and our information gets sold and used in different ways. So I think that there's again a lot of complexities around it.
Okay. Well, I believe we are about out of time. If we were to have follow-up questions, how should we direct them to you?
I am typing my email address in the chat. So if people have follow-up questions, please contact me. I love talking about this stuff. I would love to talk to you more. So, do not hesitate to reach out. This, like I said, is something that I'm really excited about. So I'm very happy that you were here for this today.
And one final thing, would you mind just briefly talking about our graduate program?
Sure. So I am writing faculty member within what we're calling the School of Communication, Media, and the Arts. And so this is the grad program we have is a master's program in composition, rhetoric, and digital media. And so sometimes people aren't really sure what those terms all mean, but basically it's a really multifaceted grad program that will teach you partly about teaching. So the teaching of writing is one part. Rhetoric, transmedia is another part, but we have a lot of courses in digital media production. So we have courses in editing, layout, and design, courses in writing with technologies, writing for technologies, and social media. So it brings together a lot of interest in a really great way. And so students coming out of our program go on to do PhDs, they go into editing and publishing, they're teachers. So there's a lot that you can do. So if you had any questions about the program, you know, again, I'd be so happy to talk to you about it.
Okay. Well, not seeing any further questions. Dr. Morris, thank you so much for presenting. I learned a lot about this topic, and I'm sure our audience did as well. So thank you so much for presenting.
Thank you.
Everyone, have a good night. And again, the recording of this session will be on our website in a few days. And again, our website is www.nova.edu/DRA. Have a good evening.
Thank you, everybody.